automatically assume that people like Basil were being sinful, isn't it just quite possible that these individuals didn't have the Roman understanding at this early time in the history of the church that Mr. Matix has today? I certainly think that that is the case. Then Mr. Matix quoted from chapters 40 and 44 of the letter of Clement and said, listen to the tone that this has. But did you catch what it said in chapters 40 and 44? It specifically presented a plurality of elders as being normative both in Corinth and in Rome. Not one successor, not one pope in Rome speaking to the Corinthians, but a plurality of elders. There is no one person writing this letter that says, I am the bishop, I am the successor of Rome, therefore I talk to you in that position. Thank you very much.
Has a 9-minute rebuttal period.
I agree with Mr. White that you need to read the whole quote to get the full reason why one of us is citing it. Mr. White, to attack the credibility of the index in the back of Jurgens, said, look, the very first citation they give you for the authority of Rome over other churches is the following. And he turned to the first citation, 10a, and he said, and he read the beginning of Clement's letter to the Corinthians, the church of God, which is at Rome, to the church at Corinth. And he said, this is simply the beginning of the letter. How could this prove this proposition? But he himself, with the page right in front of him, didn't go on to read the very next sentence. Because the very next sentence says, owing to the sudden and repeated calamities and misfortunes which have befallen us, the church at Rome, and that's either referring to the Neronian persecution, if you date this book prior to 70 AD, or the persecution under Domitian between 81 and 96. He says, we must acknowledge that we have been somewhat tardy in turning our attention to the matters in dispute among you, beloved, and especially to that abominable and a holy sedition, alien and foreign to the elect of God, which a few rash and self-willed persons have inflamed to such a madness that your venerable and illustrious name, worthy to be loved by all men, has been greatly defamed. The reason this is cited as the first evidence, not a very powerful one, admittedly, but it's the first indication, and Giles includes it himself, that the church at Rome has a self-consciousness that it itself is responsible for the behavior of other churches, that it has some right to intervene in the affairs of another church, even though it's 600 miles away in another country altogether. So please do get it. And I know that Tim was absolutely right, Tim Philiboshian, in saying that these books are somewhat hard to find and are expensive. I am willing to do this as my sort of contribution to the pursuit of truth, and that is what I want to pursue tonight. Not winning a debate, not proving that Catholicism is true no matter what, even if we have to fudge facts, or I don't want to engage in these stretching things, as Mr. White says. I would be willing to sell, and this is a precedent, I don't want to establish across the board, but I would be willing to get to you the set of Jurgens, Faith of the Early Fathers, which Biblical Foundations does sell. We don't have any tonight. I'd be willing to give it to you at cost, to not make any profit on it. As many people here as want a copy for themselves, I get it from the publisher at 40% off. I'll give it to you just at the cost. I don't want to make a penny on it, if you would like to read this yourself. I'll go further. Giles, the anthology written by the Protestant, which I mentioned, I will be willing to give you a copy of it. I will, at our own expense, the Biblical Foundation's expense, and if you knew how tiny our budget was and how a miracle it is that we can pay our bills each month. We only have one employee, and that's me, and a part-time secretary that I pay $5 an hour just to do some Xeroxing and so forth for me on an occasional basis. I will pay him to make as many Xerox copies as you would like. If you will simply give me a self-addressed stamped envelope that I can, or reimburse me for the postage so that I can get it to you in the mail, I will be happy to do this so you can study these things for yourself. Now, he mentioned Kelly also, and he said that Kelly simply argues that the Catholic Church claims that it bases its thing on Scripture. That was exactly my point in citing him. What I was seeking to do was refute the idea that the Catholic Church only invented the scriptural support for its claims for the papacy later on in the Middle Ages, not before 1000 AD or what have you. No. Kelly, a Protestant, says the papacy, through successive popes and councils, has always traced its origins and title deeds to the unique commission reported to have been given by Jesus Christ to Peter. He doesn't say he believes in the papacy for that reason. I'm not asking you to believe in it, but I'm simply asking you to believe what this historian says, that the Catholic Church has always made a biblical argument for the authority of its popes. Okay? By the way, he mentioned that Kelly says there is no monarchical, in his article on Anacletus, no monarchical episcopate until the 2nd century. And he said, did you catch that? The problem is that Mr. White himself would reject J.N.D. Kelly, though a great scholar, a liberal on this point, his liberal presuppositions of higher criticism. If you read J.N.D. Kelly's commentaries on the letters of Peter and Jude and the pastoral epistles, he follows the higher critical view that any reference to a monarchical episcopate, which you do have, in Paul's letter to Timothy and to Titus, is therefore a late development and couldn't have been written by Paul himself. So beware of people's biases when you do that. Now let's go on to the passages that Mr. White has been drawing our attention to. Irenaeus, I was in the midst of reading this. In Irenaeus, in his work against heresies, I had read the passage where he said that every church must agree with this Church of Rome. I will simply give the genealogy, the pedigree of this church. And he goes on to do that. He says, in the very next paragraph, paragraph 3, he says, the blessed apostles, and I'm reading from Giles' translation here, a Protestant, the blessed apostles, after founding and building up the church, entrusted the office of bishop to Linus. Paul speaks of this Linus in his epistles to Timothy. Anacletus then followed him. After him, in the third place after the apostles, Clement was appointed bishop. He not only saw the blessed apostles, but he also had communications with them and had their preaching ringing in his ears and before his eyes. He was not alone in this, for there were many still left at the time who had been instructed by the apostles. And then he goes on to trace the line of descent down to the pope of that particular day, Eleutherus, the 12th from the apostles, who now occupies the see. And Irenaeus says this, in the same order and in the same succession, the tradition of the apostles in the church and the preaching of the truth have come down to us. And this is a most complete proof that it is one and the same life-giving faith which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. Mr. White does not believe this. It is his theological opinion that there is no apostolic succession of bishops who faithfully transmit the truth from the apostles unto the present day. Irenaeus argues that this is the understanding of the early church, that there were people who were alive in the days of the apostles who could have protested at this usurpation of authority. In fact, this is not the case. And Irenaeus says, as an example of one of those apostolic successions, you have the apostolic succession of the Pope of Rome. He has inherited his authority from Peter and Paul himself. Tertullian is another church father that Mr. White made reference to, referred to one treatise of his. And Tertullian says this about apostolic succession. He says, besides, if any heresies dare